In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make an exploding star block. Hi everyone, Monica here. Welcome to part 6 of Time to Bloom. This is our 2024 online mystery quilt course. It's Quilt-as-you-go, it's skill building, and every month you get a bonus applique block designed by my daughter Monica Poole. You can sign up for the course at any time, and if you'd like to know more, head to the Pattern Poole website and I'll put a link in the description so you can check it out later. This month's applique block is a beautiful dragonfly amongst the blooms, and this month we're making an exploding star block. Now if you are a beginner, don't stress because we do have the easier version which you'll still get to learn the technique. So this month's techniques, we're going to do a square and a square and the flying geese no waste 4 at a time method. At first glance this block may look a little daunting, but when you break it up it's not as hard as it looks. So the center is a basic star block with a square and a square in the center, 4 flying geese for the star points and some squares in the corners. So to make the star look like it's exploding, we have 8 more flying geese blocks that are radiating out from the center and 8 rectangles with stitch and flip triangles. To bring it all together, there are 4 simple log cabin type blocks in the corners. This block looks super effective in a 2-tone color combination as it makes the block look 3-dimensional as if it really is exploding. So now that you know the components that make up this block, let's get started. Here are the pieces all cut out and ready to sew. I'm using a light and medium blue as well as a creamy grey background. The cutting instructions are in the Part 6 Time to Bloom course notes. Let's start from the centre and make the square and a square block. Take a 3-inch medium square and fold it in half with the right sides facing. Make a small crease on opposite side edges to mark the centres. Take the 2 2¾ inch squares, stack them exactly on top of each other and cut once on the diagonal. Fold each triangle in half with the wrong sides facing and mark the center of each long edge with a finger crease, being very careful to not stretch the fabric as this edge is now on the bias grain. Place 1 triangle right sides together with one edge of the square and line up the center creases with a pin. You should have an even amount of the triangle extending past both ends of the square. Pin another triangle onto the opposite side in the same way. Set your machine up to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance as shown in the Part 1 video and sew the pieces together. Press the seams in towards the center square. Trim away the excess corners. Now sew the other 2 triangles onto the remaining sides of the square in the same way. Once again, press the seams towards the center of the square. I'm pressing the seams towards the center of this square so that there will be less bulk when we join this unit onto the flying geese unit, and you'll see why soon. Now trim the unit to a 4-inch square. To do this, position your ruler with the 0 corner in the top right corner. Of course, reverse this if you are left-handed. Position the number 2 lines so that they align with the points of the center square. Now slide the ruler along until you have a 1/4 inch past each of the points. Trim up the side and across the top edge. Rotate the block so that the trimmed edges are now on the left side and the bottom edge. Align the 4-inch line of the ruler with the trimmed edge and once again trim up the side and across the top edge. Here's our complete square and a square block. Set it aside until required. Now let's make the points for the star using the 4 at a time flying geese no waste method. Well, there is a little bit of waste because I've allowed just a little bit extra fabric, so just to make it easier for trimming. To make 4 flying geese units, you'll need a 5-inch background square. I'll call this the large square, and 4 medium coloured 3-inch squares. I'll call these the small squares. Turn the small squares to the wrong side and mark a diagonal line from corner to corner. Now position the large square with the right side facing up. Place one of the small squares with the right side facing down in the bottom left corner of the large square. Now take another small square and place it in the top right corner. Make sure that the marked diagonal lines align from square to square. If you like, you can hold them in place with tiny dabs of glue in the corners. Tiny dabs of glue in the corners will ensure that the glue only stays in the seam allowance. Sew a 1/4 inch either side of the marked line. Start sewing on the second square because it overlaps the first square. Now cut on the marked line. At the ironing board, set the seam, then fold the small triangles over to the right side and gently finger press the seam towards the small triangles. Now press, being careful to not stretch the fabric because it is now on the bias grain. You will now have 2 pieces that look like this. Position 1 small square in the remaining corners of the background fabric, making sure that the marked diagonal line is centered between the small triangles. Pin or hold in place with tiny dabs of fabric glue. Once again, sew a 1/4 inch either side of the marked lines. Head back to the cutting mat and cut on the marked lines. Set the seam, then gently finger press the seam towards the small triangles and press. This will make the 4 flying geese units. Trim the flying geese back to 2 1/4 inches by 4 inch rectangles. To do this, start with the small triangles of the flying geese on the left side and the ruler with the 0 corner in the top right corner. Of course, reverse this if you are left-handed. Align the 2 inch line of the ruler with the point of the large triangle, making sure that there is enough space for a 1/4 inch seam outside the point. Slide the ruler along so that the 45-degree line is aligned with the top diagonal seam and the 4 inch line is aligned with the diagonal seam below. Trim up the side and across the top. Rotate the block so that you have the trimmed edge on the side and across the bottom. Position the ruler with the 0 corner in the top right corner. Place the 2 1/4 inch line on the trimmed edge, making sure that the 2 inch line aligns with the corner and the 4 inch line aligns with the bottom trimmed edge. Once again, trim up the side and across the top. Trim the other flying geese units in the same way. Now lay out the pieces to form the star block. Separate the pieces into rows and join the rows together. Join the top and bottom rows first. Press the seams in the top and bottom row in towards the flying geese. To align the points of the flying geese and the square in a square, use the pin trick. To pin, place the pieces with the right sides facing. Insert a pin through the point of the flying geese, then through the point of the square in a square. Squeeze the pieces together, then insert the pin from the underneath fabric back up to the top fabric. Head to the machine and sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, sliding the pins out just when you get close to it. Check that the points are aligning, then press the seam towards the flying geese. You'll see that the seam is not too bulky because the seams of the square in a square were pressed in towards the center. You could also trust that you have just trimmed everything correctly and then use glue basting. So I really recommend giving glue basting a try. I use a Soline glue pen, but if you don't have one of these, you can use any craft glue stick so long as it's non-toxic, acid-free, and what's the other thing, Laura? Water-soluble, non-toxic, and acid-free. Just make sure that you test it first. To glue baste, use your ruler to protect your ironing surface, then put the tiny dabs of glue in the seam allowance. Place the 2 pieces with the right sides facing, then press to speed up the drying process. Sew the seam, then open out to check that the seams align, and if everything is okay, press the seams towards the square in a square. Now sew the 3 rows of the star together. The seams will be facing in opposite directions, so they'll nest. Align the nested seams and the points with the pin trick or glue basting. Press the seams away from the square in a square. And here's our finished star block. Now let's make our little star block into an exploding star. Now make another 8 flying geese blocks in exactly the same way with 1 large background square and 4 medium coloured squares, and 1 large light coloured square and 4 small background squares. And here are our extra flying geese, and just to note that whenever you make flying geese this way, the large square turns out to be the large triangle in the middle. Now let's make the rectangles with the stitch and flip triangles. Place the 8 2 1/4 inch medium coloured squares with the wrong side facing up. Mark a diagonal line from corner to corner onto the wrong side of each square. Now take the remaining 2 1/4 inch by 4 inch background rectangles, place them on your cutting mat with the right sides facing up in 2 rows of 4. Place a 2 1/4 inch square at the top of each rectangle with the right sides facing. On 4 rectangles, make the diagonal line go from the bottom left to the top right. On the other 4 rectangles, make the diagonal line go in the opposite way. Now sew each piece, sewing slightly above the marked diagonal line. I used my regular 1/4 inch foot with the needle in the center position. I aligned the inner left edge of the foot with the marked line, making the stitching line slightly above the marked line. Doing this allows space for the corner of the square to easily flip over the diagonal stitching line to meet the opposite corner. Press each piece like this to ensure that the corners of the squares meet the corners of the rectangles. If the corners don't meet, it's best to unpick and re-sew. When all is good, flip back to the wrong side of the square and position the 1/4 inch line of the ruler on the stitching line. Trim away the excess fabric with a rotary cutter. And here are the 8 rectangles with the stitch and flip triangles. 4 have the triangles in the top left corner and 4 have a triangle in the top right corner. Now let's make the quarter log cabin blocks. Sew the 2 1/4 inch light squares right sides together with the 2 1/4 inch background squares. Press the seams towards the dark fabric. Rotate the units so the light fabric is at the top. Sew a 2 1/4 by 4 inch background rectangle onto the right side edge of each unit. Press the seams towards the dark fabric. Set these units aside until required. All components are now complete, so let's start joining them together to make the exploding star. Lay out the extra flying geese in 2 rows with the medium coloured units in the bottom row and the light coloured units in the top row. Make sure that the large triangles in each row are pointing up. Place the units in the top row, right sides together with the units in the bottom row. Sew them together along this edge. Pin or glue baste the pieces together. The beginning of this seam is bulky because of the diagonal seam. I find that starting with a leader can help the foot to ease over the bulk. I'm also turning the pieces over so that I can hold the seams at the point flat with the tailor's awl. Now press the seams up towards the light flying geese. Here are the joined geese. When they're laid out in a row, they look like chevrons. Now lay them out in a vertical row. Place a rectangle on the right side of each unit with the triangle in the lower right corner. Place the pieces right sides together and sew. Don't press the seams just yet. Place a rectangle on the left side of each unit with the triangle in the lower left corner. Place the pieces right sides together and sew. Now that these units are complete, press 2 with the seams facing away from the geese and 2 with the seams facing towards the geese. It will be a bit thick here, but it's not too bad, and this will save us from an even thicker spot when we join the final seams. Now finally, let's lay out the pieces to join the exploding star. We're nearly there. Place a star block on the cutting mat, position it so that on the side edges, the seams of the points are pressed away from the center. At the top and bottom edges, the star point seams will be pressed in. Place the flying geese units around the star, making sure that the seams from unit to unit are facing in opposite directions. Now place a log cabin block in each corner. Separate the pieces into 3 rows and sew the pieces together. Press the seams in the top and bottom row out and press the seams in the middle row in. Now it's time to sew the rows together. The seams will all be facing in opposite directions, so they'll nest. So you can line those nested seams up with the pin trick or glue basting, which is what I did. And here's our finished exploding star block. It should measure 14.5 inches square, but it's okay if it's slightly smaller as the background borders will make up for any loss of size. Now sew on the background borders. Then layer the block together with the batting and backing and quilt. You'll find the quilting instructions in the course notes. So if you think that this block is a little too challenging for you or too time consuming, don't forget that we do have the easier block. Now this block has bigger pieces and it has a double square and a square and also the flying geese star points, so you will get to use all of the techniques from part 6. And you'll find the step-by-step instructions with photos in the course notes. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and learnt something, and I'll see you in part 7. Bye!